Something players should look for at the table, or actually listen for, is what's called a cathartic exhale. Now, most of you have been driving around and almost hit the car in front of you. And usually this is what you will do next. You'll go, that's a cathartic exhale. We do that to relieve a large amount of stress. And in poker, we usually see it when someone goes all in and they're bluffing and they get away with it. And at the end of that, they'll go. But there's other cathartic exhales. And usually you'll see that as a more subtle type of an exhale. And that's why I encourage players not to wear earphones, which can mask being able to listen to these tells. And the cathartic exhale that I often see at the poker table is the poker player is looking at his cards repeatedly and is very frustrated with his situation, and so will often exhale under his breath. It's a cathartic exhale, and you'll hear them going like this. Very accurate tell. It's always associated with something negative, so most likely they're weak or they're marginal. A lot of players blush when they're weak, when they're bluffing and so forth. So look for changes in the facial skin tone, especially around the neck and the ears. Rarely, and I mean rarely, is skin flushing associated with anything positive. Usually it's very much associated with something negative. And most of the time when I see flushing of the skin, it's usually in the neck area, and very much indicative of someone who's extremely weak and fears detection, especially during a bluff. One of the things I've noticed over the years is that for some players, they don't realize that every time they look at their cards, they look at them differently. So the first time they look at their whole cards, maybe they look at them and they realize, oh, I've got something good, but I'll wait to see what happens. And then the flop comes out and they realize, well, that really doesn't change things for me. I still have a pretty good hand, so now they're a little bit more cautious as to how they look at their card. Well, the next community card comes out and they realize, oh my, now I have another ace. Now the value of my cards has changed, and unknowingly, how they view their cards becomes more of a cryptic game. Because the cards are now more valuable, they're treating subconsciously their cards more valuable. And of course, when the final card comes out, you see them very delicately looking at their cards, not realizing that the whole time, as the value of their cards increased, they changed how they behave toward their cards. Most players don't realize where their hands are on the table or what they're doing with their cards. If you were to suddenly freeze the game and ask them, they'd be hard-pressed to tell you. And one of the things that we often see is when we do time-lapse photography and then speed it up, is the fact that players, when they're strong, tend to move their cards each time they look at them closer to the center of the table, so that by the time they've looked at their cards 4 or 5 times, sometimes the cards are way in front. And we know that when they're weak, they tend to move the cards further back. So look for this behavior. It doesn't apply to everybody. We've seen it with a few players out there, including some pros. And again, when we like something, we move towards it, and so we tend to do it subconsciously. When we don't, we withdraw that. And it's a very good indicator that the person is strong by moving them forward and weak by moving their cards back. One of the tells that's available to you that poker players often don't think about is how they hold their cards. Now, we've talked about distancing behaviors, and one of the distancing behaviors you'll notice is when cards are valuable, we tend to hold them and touch them with our full hands. But the minute that those cards no longer have that much value to us, you'll see poker players begin to touch them with the thumb and the middle finger in the same way that we would hold maybe a dirty diaper. And when they hold the cards this way and begin to shuttle them back and forth, in fact, I refer to this as the card shuttle, there's about an 88% chance that they're going to fold. They're weak, they're marginal, they're really not that interested in continuing to play. Now, this is an important tell because a lot of times that what they're doing is telegraphing that they're going to already fold in the future, and you may be able to capitalize on that. Territorial displays are really confidence displays. When we are very confident, we tend to take up more territory. When we're less confident, we withdraw. And you'll see that at the poker table. Hands further apart, confidence, less confidence, hands together. You'll see it with the elbows. Elbows are out, very confident. Elbows come together as the person becomes indecisive. Or you may see the person actually, lean back, and if there's two chairs available, will spread out and place both hands, arms over the chairs and so forth. So we always equate territorial displays, especially when we take up more territory, with strength and confidence, and when we withdraw, we associate that with lack of confidence. One of the torso behaviors that really stands out that says, I am very enthused, I am very excited, and so forth, is called the chest heave. And you'll often see it with a player who's extremely strong. They're sitting high, and their chest, they're so excited, is literally heaving. They don't realize that the pounding chest is excited and letting everybody else know that they're sitting on a monster hand. Now, you have to be very careful with this because we've also seen in certain situations where a player who is bluffing will also have a heaving chest, but that's because of fear or concerns. And so you have to look at other clusters of behavior, such as, are they leaning away from the table? Are they turning away from the table? Is there any kind of furrowing of the forehead and so forth, which says that there's some sort of weakness or concern? And so then when we marry that up with the chest heaving, we can sort of decode it into the message that they're worried and they're concerned, and that's why their chest is heaving that way. It's because they're scared. Always remember that repetitive behaviors are soothing behaviors or pacifying behaviors. So if you see a player at the table and maybe they've got a jacket or a hoodie on and they're playing with their zipper and they're moving it up and down, or they're taking a strand of hair and playing with it, anything repetitive is a pacifier. So if put it in context, and if the situation is right, most likely they are weak because they're having to pacify. Some poker players don't realize that their whole body begins to reflect how they view their situation. And we've talked about territorial displays, but one of the ones that is always amusing to me is players who gradually withdraw. They bring their knees up, they tuck their elbows in, they sort of grasp their own shoulders, and in essence are getting into the embryo position as they're sort of breathlessly waiting for something good to happen because they're so weak, maybe marginal, but most likely they're so weak that they feel very threatened. And so they assume this position, not realizing that the whole world, even from tables over, can see what they're doing. Players most often don't realize how they're sitting at the table. And we don't always sit the same way. Usually, when we're strong, when we're very confident, we tend to sit higher. When we're weak, we tend to slouch or even lower ourselves in front of the table. And you realize, and you may say to yourself, this looks extreme. And yet there's so many videos out there showing professional players who don't realize that they're playing along, they're sitting like this, all of a sudden they realize that now they have the master hand at the table, and all of a sudden now they're sitting higher. And yet other times when they realize that maybe they've committed to the pot and there's no way now that they're going to win, and they just seem to sink lower and lower. So look for height adjustment at the table. It's a very good indicator of how that person really feels about their cards. One of the facial tells that most poker players miss is called duping delight. And that's when another player gets you to commit to the pot. And so realizing that they have a monster hand and that you have foolishly committed your resources, they'll sort of look at you like this. And duping delight has various variants. So look for this behavior. It sometimes shows up. It's very accurate. Usually the person doing it is really strong. Something you see in live play a lot that you don't see online, obviously, is a lot of stare down. And those of you who have read my books and so forth know I talk about not staring other people down. I think it's a very dangerous, precarious thing to do, because you're always going to be running into someone who possibly could outstare you. And when that happens, they're going to put you on tilt. So what I teach poker players to do is pick a spot on the board, pick a spot in your opponent's clothing, anywhere else, but don't stare at each other's eyes, because eventually you're going to be staring at somebody, they're going to be staring back at you, and all of a sudden you're going to sense that your emotions are getting out of control. And when that happens, you're not going to be thinking clearly, you're not going to be acting clearly, and you're going to be ending up realizing that you're on tilt. A very accurate tell that a poker player is actually very weak is when you see them hang on to a chair or another object. Sometimes it's the chair next to them, sometimes it's the back of their own chair, but it usually looks something like this. They'll grab onto something and then they bring their chips forward. In every instance where I've seen this, the player has been at best marginal, but usually very weak. There are several tells associated with how we handle our chips, and one of those is that you'll have players who are very sheepish as they bring their chips forward. They're very hesitant and reluctant, and we often see this with players who are weak or marginal, and they're actually reluctant to put their chips forward. And then we have other players who are so confident that they take their chips and they just plant them down with extreme authority, and you get a sense that they're very strong. Now, obviously, these can be bluffed either way. But there's a third kind, and this one I've seen in a lot of tournaments where people are so energized, they're so emotional about what's going on in the game, and they're very confident about their hand that they do what's called a rainbow toss. And that is that rather than just place the chips in front of them, they actually lose control of their emotions and they just throw the chips really high. One of the easiest ways to prevent people at the table from reading you, from picking up your tells, is to try to remain very still. Now, since 2005, when Read 'em and Reap came out, you've noticed that a lot of pro players, when they're playing in the final table, are assuming what's been now called the Navarro perch. And it looks like this. They put their elbows down, they tuck their thumbs underneath their chin, and they cover their mouth with their fingers. Now, the effectiveness of this is that you can look at your cards, you can go right into this position, and from this position then you begin to look at the board, look at the other players, and so forth. We know that psychologically what happens is that the more restrained you are, the less people will be able to pick up from you. We have what's called an orientation reflex, and at the table people will orient towards any movement. So if other players are moving, they're going to be looking at them. If you're holding very still in this Navarro perch, then what's going to happen is psychologically over time they're going to ignore you. Now true, you're not going to be a lot of fun to play with, but you are preserving your pot because they're just not going to be able to pick up tells from your neck, from your mouth, from your chin, from your hands in the same way that someone who's sitting there with their front side completely open to others to see are going to be more vulnerable to attack. One of the best times to collect tells is right when a table is first formed. No one's paying attention to tells, and yet we know that it's at this time when many of the tells that you will see during the game is when they show up. As people sit down and adjust around the table and they bump into each other and place their elbows and look at each other and look at their chips and do different things, their bodies will reveal many of the tells that you'll see later on. So you'll see some people biting their lip, others will be stroking their head, doing different things. This is a good way to collect information. It's free, doesn't cost anything, doesn't take a whole lot of time, and best of all, these behaviors are pure. Since they know that they're not being watched, since they know they're not under the gun, they think nobody's noticing, and it's a great way to collect poker intelligence. Pacifying is a way of life in poker because there's always going to be stress, and how we deal with stress, I've already said, is by self-touching, by rubbing our hands, and so forth. But one of the things you want to look for is when players do what I call sneaking a feel. So if they're holding their hands together, maybe they'll just move one finger and stroke their other hand. Or if they have a hand up to their face, instead of scratching vigorously, what they'll do is they'll just sneak a little feel. And in essence, what they're doing is they're dealing with stress, but they're doing it in such a way that they don't want you to notice that they are under stress. And when you see that, most likely the player is either weak or marginal, and in most cases that I've observed, they're usually either bluffing or they are in fact very weak. Tells from the hands are very instructive, and poker players often don't realize that their hands are revealing exactly what they're thinking or intending. One of the things I've observed over the years is that when poker players are strong or something happens on the table and they're going to act, they sort of release their hands. So during the game they've had their hands wound up together, or maybe they've massaged them, or maybe they've withdrawn them from the table. But as soon as they realize that they're going to do something, they're going to engage in the game, they're going to go in or they're going to act, their hands get into the ready position, and you see the hands dramatically change. So look for the hands to indicate to you intentions, because oftentimes, just as other people have said, you know, when that hand immediately goes for the chips, well, sometimes it doesn't have to go immediately go to the chips. Sometimes what you'll see is the hands get in the ready position, and that signals that they're going to get involved, and most likely they have a very strong hand. When it comes to poker tells, one tell in particular, which I noticed from the very beginning, was how poker players tended to treat their cards differently depending on how they felt about them. So poker players sometimes will look at their cards and then they'll just put their hands flat right on top. And yet, if something happens on the board where suddenly those cards become more valuable, one of the things that I noticed is that poker players would then arch their hands over the cards. as though they were imprisoning their cards. In a way, they're transmitting, these cards now have more value to me. And so if you notice a change in how a poker player handles his cards, going from his hand is flat to now he's arching over the cards, most likely that poker player is strong. One of the ways poker players pacify themselves is by putting pressure on their face, and to deal with the stress of either being weak or insecure or really just being upset over a situation. Sometimes you'll see them, they'll stick a finger right up against their cheek and force it really far in. Definitely a sign of weakness. Or you'll see it with two fingers where they grasp their cheek and they squeeze it together. Now, there's a lot of scientific reason for why we do that, but just be aware of this. When people are strong, they don't need to do that. So when you see it at the table, chances are the player is very weak. One of the other tells that's out there that's very often missed, and it has to do with what's called the rogatory position of the hands. Now, most of the times when we place our hands on the table or on our cards and so forth, we're palm down. But every once in a while, you'll notice that a player is considering his or her situation, puts in a little bit for the pot, and then when they bring their hands back, you'll notice that instead of putting their palms back down, they place their palms up. In every situation I have seen this, literally the rogatory or prayer position, the player has been extremely weak. In fact, we save this behavior, this palm up behavior, for when we're pleading to be believed, when we're sort of handing ourselves over to a higher authority and so forth. So look for the palm up behavior, especially when the player has had their hands down most of the time, to indicate I really have nothing. And that's exactly what they're communicating with the palm up. Players don't often realize that they do silly things that they've been doing since they were children. For instance, they look at the cards that are on deck, they look at their whole cards, and all of a sudden, without realizing, go the very same behavior they did when their mother said to them, "We're going to Disney." Yes, it's a pacifier, but it's one that we use when we're excited about something. So be very careful. It's a very accurate tell. You'll often see it with individuals who are suddenly very strong, or they just learned they have the nuts, and so they are excited for the game. One of the tells of the hands that often goes unnoticed is the players who grab their wrist, and you'll see it like this. They'll look at their cards. They'll be pensive for a minute as they think about it. They decide they're going to commit to the pot, and then when their hands come back, they don't come back on top of their cards, but it changes. You'll see that they grab the wrist of the opposite hand as they wait to see what happens on the table. In the instances where I've seen this behavior, and it's been quite often, usually the player is very marginal or weak. And it's something that is often missed, yet easy to pick up because it's so in front of us. So look for the wrist holding behavior to tell us that someone is either marginal or weak. Sometimes at the table you'll see players stretching and so forth, and that's natural and to be expected at a game. But notice for players who, when they've taken some action at the table, after they've contributed to the pot, maybe put their hands back on top of their cards, all of a sudden lean back and stretch this way. This is actually a pacifier. It helps the person relieve stress. So when you see it in response to some action that has just taken place, it's usually indicative that the person is either marginal or weak and that they lack confidence. Look for thumb displays at the table to give you some sort of clue as to what's going on in the other player's mind. For instance, we've talked about that when we don't like the situation at the table, we tend to withdraw. But we also see something which is really rather peculiar, and that is when you see a player move away from the table and then tuck his thumbs inside his pant pockets, or maybe even tuck them inside his belt line. What in essence he's doing is saying, I feel weak, I don't have confidence. This is not a confidence display. It's fairly accurate. So be looking for those two things, moving away from the table and then tucking those fingers away in the pockets, which really say, I don't have a very strong hand. A lot of times stress shows up in our throat area in the form of a very hard swallow. You'll see someone looking at their situation, maybe making a decision, looking at their cards, and you'll see them go like this. Truly, truly a universal tell that they're having difficulty, that they're marginal or weak, and that they lack confidence. Also consistent with that is when we do an Adam's apple jump. It's basically the same behavior, only for some people the Adam's apple is out of control and jumps upward very quickly, and others it's something that they do when they swallow hard, like that. The jaw drop is a behavior you often see when a person is very weak and they fear something. And you often see it in poker where you're sitting there waiting to see what happens around the table, and all of a sudden someone you never expected to call or raise calls and raises and puts you in a terrible position, and then you do something like this. When that jaw drops and the person holds very still, you're weak, very weak. Sometimes when poker players are confronted with a situation they're not sure, most likely they're marginal or they're weak, you'll see something called jaw displacement. And here's what it looks like. They'll look at what's on the board, they'll look at their own cards, and as they ponder what to do, you'll see them doing this. That's jaw displacement. Chances are, 80% of the time, they're either weak or marginal. Players really never know where their chin is at. If you ask them, they don't know if it's sitting high, if it's down, or if it's low. But we know this. When we're very confident, our chin tends to sit very high. This is especially true with European players, where in Europe, by social convention, you're supposed to be sitting or standing with your chin very high when you feel confident. When you lack confidence, when you are weak or marginal, you tend to lower your chin. And of course, there's those situations where players are so weak or they perceive themselves as so in danger that you'll often see them pull away from their table, which is distancing, and they tuck their chin way, way in. And that is an extremely accurate indicator that they perceive themselves as very weak. Just as jaw displacement is a pacifier, so is yawning. And a lot of times players, when they're bluffing, they'll go all in, and then the next thing you'll see is they'll yawn. They'll go, what they're really saying is, I'm weak. And it's often masked, but that's why a lot of times when I used to be in the FBI, I used to see a lot of people under arrest yawning, and it wasn't because of the time of day. It's because that's a great way to release stress. So if you see it at the table, ask yourself, it's most likely that this person is actually marginal or weak. Consistent with what I've talked about previously, which is the freeze response, is oftentimes you'll see poker players who are so concerned about what they're doing that they'll actually hold their breath. So they may look at their cards, decide that they're going to commit a large amount of chips to the pot, and then they wait very cautiously the whole time they're holding their breath. This is a very good sign that most likely they're weak. At best, they're marginal. It's a true freeze response, and it's something you should look for.